begin with the Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise. Place your hand over your heart and join me. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, I'll now read a series of procedural announcements for today's meeting. And we did get the recording started, Uni, right? Yeah, I thought I heard that. Okay, so this meeting is being conducted in person at the Santa Clarita Valley Water Agency Rio Vista Water Treatment Plant Boardroom. As a convenience to the public, members of the public may also participate virtually by logging into the agency's Zoom meeting. Any member of the public may listen to the meeting or make comments to the board using the call-in number or Zoom webinar link. Okay. In the event there is a disruption of service which prevents the agency from broadcasting the meeting to members of the public using either the call-in option or the internet service, this meeting will not be postponed or rescheduled, but will continue without the remote participation. The remote participation option is being provided as a convenience to the public and is not required. Members of the public are welcome to attend the meeting in person. To participate in public comment from your computer, tablet, or smartphone, when I announce the agenda item you wish to speak on, click the raise hand feature in Zoom. You'll be notified when it's your turn to speak. Please unmute when requested. To participate in public comment via phone, when I announce the agenda item you wish to speak on, dial *9 to raise your hand. When it's your turn to speak, dial *6 to unmute. Okay, so let's check to see if there is public present that would like to speak on one or more of the items. I think we have one for item 3.1. Anyone in virtual land, Uni?
There's none at this time.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on then. So I'll now read the procedure for today. Oops. Yep, I'll now read the procedure for today's meeting. They are as follows. I will introduce each agenda item. Staff will then present. I'll ask for public comments, and I'll then ask for discussions and questions from board members. Once concluded, I will ask for a motion and a second. And after any further discussion, the board secretary will call for roll call votes. Okay, so I believe that all members are present with one exception. I think Board Director Gibbs is alternate is here today. That's Director, right, Uni? Director Lorene West?
Yes, that's correct.
Alternates are addressed as director as well.
Yes,
okay.
They are.
Thank you. Okay, so let's continue with the guidelines above. I think that takes us to 1.3 public comments. So members of the public may comment as to items within the subject matter jurisdiction of the agency that are not on the agenda at this time. We ask that members of the public wishing to comment on items that are listed on this agenda do so at the time each item is considered. So for general comments, are there any public comments on items not covered in this agenda? Take a second. Virtual land?
There is none.
Okay, thank you, Uni. Okay, I think that takes us to item 1.4, approval of the agenda. Are there any changes, additions, or modifications to the agenda? Very well. Seeing none, the agenda is approved. That was my first approval item. Thank you. Okay. Very good. Let's move on to the consent calendar. This is item 2, the approval of the consent calendar. Are there any public comments on the consent calendar, specifically the approval, specifically the previous meeting notes? Seeing none. Any board discussion?
I move approval of the consent calendar.
Thank you,
Goodside.
Director Goodside.
Second.
Very good. Roll call vote, Uni, or I should pause. Any discussion? Very good. Uni?
When I state your name, please state your vote. Director Cooper,
Yes.
Director Goodside,
Yes.
Director Natoli,
Aye.
Director Olzahowski,
Abstain.
Director West,
Abstain, wasn't present.
Vice President Martin,
Yes.
President Biden.
Yes.
Thank you. This item passed.
Okay, very good. That takes us to item 3.1. This is the Santa Clarita Valley Groundwater Sustainability Plan, Groundwater Dependent Ecosystem Monitoring Protocol. And I believe we'll get a presentation by Mr. Verdukes.
Thank you, President Biden, and good afternoon, directors. It's nice to be here in person again. We do have a presentation on this item. Tom Barnes on my left is going to help with this. I'll introduce a few slides. Tom is with ESA and his team did the biology work that's described in this. Just as a quick bit of background, and Uni, next slide, please. Recall that in the lead up to groundwater sustainability plan development, there was a lot of discussion about this new requirement from the state about groundwater dependent ecosystems. They need to be looked at. Undesirable results to GDEs should be avoided. Monitoring needs to be in place. Plans need to be in place. Management actions, in other words, in case there's undesirable results. And so the groundwater sustainability plan, after, 3 years or so of development, included a pretty robust process to evaluate GDEs. And the report that Tom is going to run through today goes through our first run through of that process. And next slide, please. So the process at a high level. You get the next slide. Oh, we're working on it. You got it. Okay. At a high level, the process requires that if groundwater elevations in these special wells called GDE wells reach a low groundwater elevation, an evaluation of the groundwater dependent ecosystems would take place. And if that evaluation determined that undesirable results were occurring and that it was caused by groundwater pumping, then management actions would be implemented. The evaluation needs to look at biologic conditions, but it also has to look at groundwater level trends, because if undesirable results are identified, then we're called to determine if groundwater pumping could cause that. So we need to look at the biology and also the groundwater levels. So there was a protocol that was developed following a field meeting in March. And that field meeting, I believe, Tom, also included 5 Point, where the team did sort of a review of some of the GDE areas and looked at the kind of information that would help us make these determinations moving forward. Next slide, please. So the board memo you have describes the process leading towards conducting the GDE evaluation. We collected data in August. We prepared a data report. Some drought stress was seen. That was not unexpected. It's August, Santa Clarita, it's hot. No clear undesirable results were present at the time, but some drought stress was. But we realized after a separate effort that after surveying in the GDE wells that we had a technical issue with one of the triggers, and that the water level was below the trigger at GDEA. And so we thought, okay, well, we're not seeing undesirable results. We see surface flow in this area, but yet the GSP says that if we reach this level, we're required to do an evaluation. So we move forward with that. And next slide, please. And after moving forward with that, we made a series of determinations. The first use of the new process worked well. Undesirable to groundwater dependent ecosystems weren't identified. No management actions were recommended. We have issues with the trigger levels and minimum thresholds at the GDE wells that need to be refined. We'll continue working with 5 Point to obtain biologic and groundwater data. And by the way, they did provide data recently to us, which is included in the annual report that John will talk about. So we want to give them credit for that. And we'll continue collecting data from multiple sources, meaning temperature probes, GDE wells, stream gauges, field observations as we make them, et cetera. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Tom to walk through the details. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Rick. And thank you to the board for giving us the opportunity at ESA to do some of this good biological monitoring for you, and the opportunity to present our results for this last year. We do need the next slide. So as Rick identified in March of 2022, we had a big crew of folks that included 5 Point representatives, and we walked up and down the river. We met and we talked about what it was that was biological resources, what the ecological values were in the different spots, because it changes from the east down to the western side. And we had a really nice full day as we moved point by point down the river together, trying to understand how to develop monitoring protocol that would provide the agency with quality data on biology that's repeatable, the collection of that data being repeatable year over year, and wanted to set a protocol in place to get that started. So we did that and created a protocol which really was founded on 3 different types of survey methods. And we called them A, B, and C. In this table here is really the content of our monitoring protocol. At various locations, I'll show you a map of where those locations, what we selected could be and are at this point. We would conduct these 3 different survey types. The first type is the first important one, method A. We will do an assessment of the extent of the riparian canopy edge. So pretty much on both sides of the river, evaluating the vegetation that's furthest from, that's probably the highest elevation within the river corridor and the furthest from groundwater, to try to get a sense of whether or not that vegetation was responding to water stress. Really, the first indication of that water stress will be on the outer edges. So we really wanted to make sure that method A was to evaluate the conditions of the canopy, and particularly at the edge. And we would do that protocol when levels approached a low, approaching the trigger, when they were low seasonally or after a period of dry years, to go out there and really make sure that somebody is watching this GDE and we're considering its health. The priority of that method was high. Then a second method was B, surface water. While we're out there, we'll record whether or not there's surface water, and that's going to be good information moving forward. Was the river flowing at this time or was it not? And depending on which location you are, you were going to get different answers at different times of year. So it's going to be a good data set moving forward. And then method C, just basic vegetation mapping. So we've got on various points of the river, we've identified polygons, basically areas of survey that are both sides, that cover both sides of the river, across the river, and we'll do vegetation mapping at a high level using CDFW approved classifications for habitat. Since that doesn't change that much, we recommended every 5 years to go out and do that kind of detailed veg mapping. Medium high priority, because it's this indicator is not about acute stress. It's just sort of a long-term gauge of the health and the extent and the dynamics of this resource. Next slide. So this is again still part of the monitoring protocol we put together. A little hard to read on this slide, but each of the inset boxes identifies a target monitoring location. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Looks like we have 9 targeted locations here, each with a little green box. Those green lines indicate where we'll do the veg mapping, where the vegetation mapping on either side of the river and across the river, to keep track of what's growing out there and what it might be thriving on. Where's the water source? It's all focused within the areas that in the central part of this watershed, in the main stem of the Santa Clara River, which has really been the focus of the groundwater dependent ecosystems and the result of mapping done in the GSP. Next slide. So those areas were identified as target areas that we'd like to collect. 5 Point installed some piezometers downstream as well at those locations, and so the biology monitoring locations will occur at the same place that piezometers exist. And in August, we went to test this monitoring protocol where we could, which was only above I-5. So east of I-5, we did 3 monitoring locations east of I-5 and are still working out with 5 Point, getting access to their locations downstream to continue to apply this protocol in years moving forward downstream. So in August, we looked at the 3 next to I-5. It was hot. The weather was hot. The monitoring protocol was implemented, including we did all A, B, and C. So we mapped the vegetation and we looked for stress indicators, water stress indicators at the edges and throughout. The report then came in, mapped vegetation, documented signs of minor stress at the edges of some of the habitat. In particular, MLA, the farthest east, which is farthest away from the uprising upwelling groundwater, started to begin to show more stress, as would be the expected, being the farthest upstream and closest to the dry gap just above.
Mr. President, I'm sorry, Tom, if I could interrupt. Mr. President, may I ask a question?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. The 9 data collection locations, how were those selected and who made the selection?
Good question. They were selected to create an index or of typical area types based on the hydrology of the gaining and losing reaches of the river, and also the proximity of the closest monitoring well, so that we could at any time gauge the biology response to the groundwater data and get some good indication of if the response was connected to the groundwater depth.
So different vegetation types, you considered these samples of the different vegetation types in the groundwater basin, and then
the groundwater dependent ecosystems was an exercise we did 3 years ago, supporting the groundwater sustainability plan to identify, based on letting the vegetation tell us where the water is. There are certain plants that don't need year-round access to groundwater and certain plants that do. So when you find the cottonwoods and when you find the willow trees, you know there's a water source. You don't know where it's coming from necessarily. It could be from urban stream runoff, or it could be access to groundwater. So we mapped all of those areas, and that was the first focus point of how to develop this, where to monitor in the future, was in the areas that could be potentially groundwater dependent ecosystems. And then we carved up and did 9 different pieces, 9 different locations along the whole corridor to try to get a representative sampling of the potential impacts of groundwater accessibility to plants.
and so it was your team that chose the locations.
It was,
All right.
yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President.
I think we have one more clarifying question. Director Cooper?
Tom, just east of I-5 and then west of I-5, the areas that you looked at, that's where the Arunda starts in those areas. Is there some thought that the Arunda contributes to the stress of those plants that are on the outer edges of the rivers as well? Because they take a great deal of water.
There is a certainly a relationship there, but we're not in the process right now of causal determinations in this biological monitoring. We're just bringing in the data from what we see. So unfortunately, we didn't have 2 years of data before they took all the Arundo out, because if we did, we'd be able to see the next 2 years if indeed there was an effect from the Arundo. But here we go in our first year and the Arundo's out. So there will be areas downstream where there is Arundo now, and we'll start that data set. And again, our goal is to provide a robust quality data set in repeatable ways that we can use to understand the impacts of access to water.
Okay. Related questions. I remember when we were working on identifying the GDEs, there were some that I think we were told we'll check them out later, specifically around Sand Canyon, getting, to the far side along.
Yeah.
What is it called? Is that work done?
That work is not done.
Okay,
Director Goodside. But we intend to get that done. We've
Okay.
identified 5 or 6 upland locations or areas outside of the alluvial aquifer boundaries or influence. And it is our intent to go and start that data collection record as well.
okay,
So we'll get that started in 2023.
okay. But I understand your 9 locations were picked because of proximity to wells, but you only looked at 3 in August 2022. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, but the 9 are what you're going to keep checking on.
We hope to work with our, private landowner partners and have that standardized protocol apply to those wells as well, or those monitoring locations as well. And we developed the protocol in concert with 5 Point representatives.
And then last question, you've talked a couple times about the data, and I remember this, the public concern about data. Do we have a formal repository for this, or reports just going on the website, or would it be like public information request if somebody wanted to see the data at this point?
Director Goodside, can you be more specific about which data? For example, the reports that we provide to your board are on the website.
Mhm.
What other data are you?
Well, water elevations, whether things are getting near the trigger or not,
Mm-hmm.
even this would be in a report, I assume, these year-to-year tests, but yeah.
Right.
Is there a giant repository of data somewhere, or how's that gonna look?
So the hydrographs that you mentioned with the triggers, they're in this report. No, we don't currently have something on the GSA website that shows the current water levels and the triggers.
Okay.
We are working with another consultant, Geosyntec, to complete a data management system that will give us
Yeah.
the ability to do very quick queries of the current conditions.
Yeah, that's what I was remembering. So
Mhm.
that's still in process.
Still in process.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. Any further questions?
Thank you. So
Thank you for your presentation. I didn't realize this was the time for questions. I didn't know this was the end of your presentation.
It
but
is not.
I wanted to, it's not, okay, well. I
But
figured
go
I'd
ahead.
bet-
We're on a roll. Let's
I
get it.
better ask it before it is the end and I'm passed by, so. So I want to go back to something you pointed out in an earlier slide where the some refinement was needed in the GDE trigger levels to some not aligned with the GSP at this point. Can you kind of explain what it is you, a little more detail there?
Sure. We have let me take a step back. So when we developed the groundwater sustainability plan and this approach for triggers, we knew we needed trigger levels in the river, but we didn't have wells in the river. And so we used the flow model that included our best understanding of ground surface elevations and other factors to estimate those initial triggers. But when we went out in the field and we installed the piezometers and began to collect ground surface elevations, we did transects across the river. We put data loggers in the piezometers. And when we put all the pieces together, we realized, yeah, these don't make sense. These initial triggers that were created, they didn't track what we said they would track in the groundwater sustainability plan. They were set too high. And so we realized we had that technical issue, which simply arose because we didn't have good empirical data in the river at the time. And so our elevations were off. And that's what led up to that.
Okay. Thanks, Rick.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
All right. I
You're welcome.
appreciate that iterative process. Okay, so let's see if we can hold questions. Let's keep rolling.
thank you, Director Bryden. I think we can go to the next slide. So here is after this August boots on the ground monitoring effort, we prepared a report and submitted this draft report. And this is a key part of that report. Each one of these insets is monitoring location, an MLA. So if you start on the right side, that's the farthest upstream to the east, and it's mapped with a certain type of woodland forest there. And it looks pretty homogeneous with some dry areas. It does have a groundwater, a new well at that location. The one in the middle then is monitoring location AA, and that's right at the confluence of the San Francisco Creek. And that shows a slightly more dense forest of cottonwood forest and hardwood forest that's pretty homogeneous across as well, with some dry sandy areas going through it. And then on the left there, you see monitoring location B as showing some cottonwood forest on the upper bank. There's a ledge there, and then going the brown is a darker, a deeper forest and willow contributing to that habitat area in some good density there where the river corridor goes through. So you can really see this tracks with any veg map or any aerial photograph that you could see as well. We did another exercise then as part of Protocol A, and as part of the monitoring protocol in Method A. In the next slide, please. We include, and we're going to include in the future, satellite imagery that is publicly available and downloaded with pretty frequently, so that we can match our monitoring time period with data from satellite. And this satellite information shows moisture content. And you can see it's a little pixelated because it's coming from a satellite, but actually it provides us with really great indication of where the moisture is. And if you look over at MLA, you'll see that a lot of that is dry. A lot of that is upland, or not a lot of access to moisture there, except for that one corridor that goes across on the top. And that kind of does comport with what we see out there, which is surface water flowing. It's just downstream from the WRP discharges and from some urban runoff areas as well, from Bouquet Creek, Bouquet Canyon. So really interesting to use that publicly available data to show that, yes, indeed, that's where the corridor really is at its most dense, and there's moisture there. When you move over to MLA, it's a broader area of vegetation. It's not just in one corridor or one low flow channel. It's really spread out across, which indicates maybe there's more of a groundwater access in that area than upstream. And then if you move to the left, MLB, you've got the dry area, sort of more dry area on the top, and then the channel itself, very dense water moisture availability there. And that really comports with the empirical data that shows that the green part is down in the channel and the white area is up on the bench. Still having some cottonwoods up there and still part of our monitoring protocol, but up on the bench elevation-wise away from the channel. So let's show some pictures then of the event. This is MLA, again, farthest east, a lot of dry channel that we're all familiar with, but there's some pretty tall trees there, indicating there's definitely moisture there, and it's either surface water related or otherwise, but there's definitely moisture there that we're looking at. Next slide. And that's just an indication of a relatively young cottonwood tree sitting in the middle of that channel. Next. And then we're over at MLA-A, which is right there at San Francisco, and we're at the edge of the channel, and you can see quite tall, mature cottonwood trees and some willows there in the background as well. They're edged by sort of an upland scrub, but there's some roots and some moisture there. You can tell from just looking at that. Next slide. And again, in MLA-A, some pretty mature cottonwoods and healthy vegetation. Next slide. MLB, close to the I-5 bridge then, some right at the riprap there, the edge of the channel, some substantial old cottonwood trees that have had their roots in the water for their whole lives, for a very long time. Next slide. But then there's this other area in MLB, which is on that bench I mentioned, and it is got grasslands on it, but some nice old cottonwoods up there too. So we're still going to monitor that area as well. That's an important part of that overall floodplain. So that's the photographs coming out of the August event. Next slide. We then, to follow the protocol for the GSP to really provide this board with data and intel from the field on an annual basis. We've got access to these two new groundwater wells, GDEA and GDEB, which is just a tremendous asset moving forward. And congratulations for getting those in, because we'll be able to watch groundwater levels in real time from here on out if they don't get blown out by the storms, which they did not, I hear. Key findings for MLA is that groundwater elevations are pretty deep. So probably much deeper than the root zones of any of those trees out there. So surface water probably plays a big role in supporting that vegetation, but nonetheless, we'll continue to monitor it. We didn't see any undesirable results and none anticipated. And this was in August. Key findings then for MLB, the other monitoring well location, again, groundwater elevations at this site are relatively shallow and relatively stable over from the March. We installed them in March and have a data set, which I'll show you on a hydrograph in a second. It's pretty stable there for close to the I-5 bridge. And then around September, like a couple of weeks after we went out there, the piezometer indicated that the water started to rise a little bit. And so in terms of impacts to groundwater dependent ecosystems, in September, it was looking good. Water's coming back up. And sure enough, we've had a wet winter and the water is high now. So we didn't see any undesirable results associated with groundwater in that location either. Next slide. So this is the hydrograph from MLA, farthest upstream, that, as I said, 30 feet below ground surface or so. These lines are in 1/2 foot increments. And so we're talking about a 5 or 4 foot drop from March into the middle of the summer in this location. And then it started to settle down and go horizontal and not dip down as much by August. And again, knowing that it rained a little bit in October, we expect that this, in fact, I believe we have data to show that it's recovered considerably due to the rains starting in the fall. And so that well has recovered substantially. Next slide. Then this is close to the I-5 bridge in MLB. And you can see these increments are in quarter feet, I believe. And so it's about 1 foot of difference there over the year, starting in March. So not much change compared to the other one. So this one has more of a steady groundwater flow here. And we see that it gets at its lowest right about the time we did our surveys in August. So we were really looking at when those plants would be stressed the most. That water started to come back up. And certainly now that water is flowing. And it's all surface water flowing out downriver now because of all the rains we've had. So that's what we looked at. And next slide. And I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Tom. Yeah, just wrapping up. So next steps, we'll continue to work with the flow model calibration to refine the triggers that we've talked about. And we'll continue working with 5 Point for future monitoring, and we'll continue to collect and review the data moving forward. So we're looking at groundwater elevation data, surface water flow, stream gauging data, temperature data, et cetera. So data continues to be collected. And with that, I think we could be happy to answer any questions that your board may have.
Thank you, gentlemen, for the presentation. Let's go to public comments first. I have one card. And while she's coming up, Uni, is there anyone in virtually?
There is none.
Okay, I'll check one more time.
Okay.
These things happen.
I think they happen more to me than anybody else. Technology is not my friend. So I have a couple of concerns with this
Oh,
report.
if you could state your name.
Lynn Plambeck.
Thank you.
First of all, when you read the report, it says in attachment A, there are some signs of dieback and stress. Doesn't say there's no signs of dieback and stress. And I just encourage you to actually read the report because it's a little bit not, I mean, it's not quite as rosy as they gave you. And then the other thing that really concerned me was, okay, you're supposed to have 9 monitoring areas, but because the developer won't give access or something, you only have 3. That's I think the board should be concerned about that. I also would like to ask and have someone make it clear who is doing the monitoring, because if it's the developer that's building in the area, I think that's inappropriate for him to be doing the monitoring for the GSA. And I would really think that it's important that you all question that. The other thing that is missing from this report, as far as I can see, and maybe I missed it somewhere, so I want to be polite and not say that, but no one mentioned that we had a very substantial number of wells off, not pumping in this valley because of PFAS. And that would, of course, make everything look rosy because we weren't pumping in half the wells or something like that, 40% of the wells, or maybe they have been able to turn some of them back on now with wellhead treatment. So, but not during the March period, we didn't have those wells on yet. And so we have a really lot of wells that were substantial production wells that weren't functioning. So to say everything is looking good, well, sure, it's looking good, but maybe next year when you turn the wells back on, or we hit the next drought when we're pumping full bore on all our wells, it's not going to look good. So I just think that there's information missing, there's data gaps in this, and that someone should be stating that we were not in full production last year, because when you turn those wells back on, it really could be a problem. And I noticed there was nothing at all said about the Valley Oak Savanna that a lot of us have stressed that got below the Vados zone for the oak trees. And I can provide data on what that does to Valley Oak Savannas if you're interested in that. So that's all I wanted to say, but I would appreciate the clarification. Who is doing the monitoring? Is it 5 Point or is it us? Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Uni, one more time. Virtual.
There is none.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to director comments. Director Bootside.
One question of mine was on MLA. You said the groundwater was below the root zone. How close does the groundwater need to be to the root zone for it to be a GDE? I mean, in other words, at a certain point, is it not a GDE if the groundwater is not making, because that one's at the sand district outfall, correct? So like, is it still qualified as a GDE with the groundwater below the root zone?
Right now, we're still monitoring. It may end up falling out as a GDE, but we'd like to collect a little bit more data first.
Okay.
The approach we used in the groundwater sustainability plan is, and even consistent with the Nature Conservancy's guidance, was that GDEs are typically present where groundwater is within 30 feet of the ground surface. Do I have that right? Yeah.
Okay.
So this area could come out as a GDE, but
We're not sure yet.
we're not sure yet.
Okay.
And actually, any of these areas, as we learn more, may be
Right.
modified.
Right. And thank you. That was my question, but I would like responses to some of the questions by the public commenter. I mean, I would assume that we're doing our own monitoring or someone is under contract to us.
Yes, we are doing the monitoring. Steve, did you want to speak to
Yeah,
that?
maybe I will, just to bring the board fully up to speed on the status of the access agreement and the data sharing agreement that is being negotiated with 5 Point right now. initially, the intent was to have the Groundwater Sustainability Agency put in the wells and monitor the wells. 5 Point had offered to put those wells in, to actually construct them.
The three that they did.
Mhm.
Mhm.
And so we thought that that was, fine if they wanted to do that on their own lands
Mhm.
and making sure that it was, they were built in a way that was going to provide the data that was necessary. The data sharing agreement itself deals with the groundwater levels as well as the GDE areas. The way it's structured right now is that 5 Point can hire the biologist
Mhm.
with our approval.
Mhm.
And there is a shadowing provision for our biologists to also go out when that monitoring is being conducted. So how that actually, and if they choose not to do that, then it will be our biologist solely that goes out and does that monitoring.
But that's, you keep saying biologist, that's not the groundwater monitoring. Or is it?
It's a little bit of the levels
actual-
themselves,
yes.
those have been historically and are projected to continue to be monitored by 5 Point.
Oh, okay. Okay, two quick related questions. So we have three piezometers in. 5 Point doesn't own the whole river. So are other piezometers gonna be done by us, or what are we using for the other locations?
So the three locations that were upstream, those were the ones that were identified in the groundwater sustainability plan. So those are in.
Yeah,
The other locations are on 5 Point property downstream
oh, okay.
from those locations.
So all of the river monitoring is on land owned by 5 Point.
But for the three that were presented today,
Okay, but they're monitoring those.
the
The-
data is being collected, yes.
Yeah, okay. Oh, okay. And then lastly, as far as comparison year to year from pumping, if we were down on pumping this year and, maybe 2-3 years from now, it's vastly different. Is that data in the report somewhere? Cumulative pumping or something? I don't remember, but you're saying yes. Okay. If somebody would just say it's in there.
It's in the
Somewhere.
annual report. It's not in the GDE report.
Oh.
Go ahead, Tom.
Can I make a comment on that?
Yes.
I think that irrespective of the pumping, we have a first year of data collection, which is great. And if it changes in the future, we'll have something to compare to, which is the whole idea. So if the pumping is different next year or at different times of different years, we'll be able to compare that to the existing conditions. So if this year indeed was a low pumping year, then we'll get a good indicator of any effects that might have on vegetation.
But you just said it's not in the GDE report. It would have to be cross-referenced then.
The amount of pumping is not in our right, or not in our biology data collection report. correct?
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah,
just
it's in
to be clear on that, the structure of the reports are an annual report, GDE evaluation. So the information that you're referencing is going to be in the annual report.
Somebody could find.
Yes.
More discussion. Director West.
Thank you. It's the wrong one. Thank you. Did you take an account adjacent to I-5 at the river when you were doing the checking of vegetation monitoring, the impact from Sand District 26 outfall? It's about 7 million gallons a day going into the river.
That's from the Saugus plant.
Yes, Saugus plant. I didn't want to get into the plant 32 on the other side because that wasn't where you were checking.
We recognize the outfall up at GDEA was contributing surface flow. As the creek meanders further downstream, that flow goes underground and then groundwater reemerges down near Interstate 5. We think some of that is made up of the water reclamation plant effluent, but I can't tell you exactly how much.
Well, I just think it's important to note that there's almost 20 million gallons of effluent going into the river, and we're all looking in the future at having recycled water. And it would be relevant to this agency as well as the sanitation district and the public if we could figure out how to get with your studies and the necessity for converting landscapes over to pretty much drought tolerant, how we can access that water, where can it benefit the public? And I know it's a touchy subject and it's not something in the parameter of what you're studying, but you do have that water going into the river every day and it's consistent. Water comes into the valley, goes into the river. Obviously, a lot of it goes underground. So it's consistent because public uses about the same amount of water all year round. So I wanted to know about that, at least put the thought on the table. And I guess we're not to the east side study yet. That's the next item. Talk about that because I have some questions and thoughts about that. But I've spent most of my life here, so I've seen no rain. I've seen 60 inches of rain. I've seen this flood. I've seen the drought. And so, yeah, it's really important that you're doing this work, and I applaud the agency for doing. But there are a lot of other ancillary little issues that would be helpful to get the whole picture together. And I just think it's important to look at interagency contact so we can benefit by using everything. In other words, add up all the math, not just some of the apples in the barrel, but the whole barrel. And I just think that it would be important for the public to understand they still think that we'll get a great rain and the drought will be over. And we really need in this state to remember that water is so precious. And even if we have a lot of it, we should use it wisely. So that's my question for the moment until we get to the next item.
Okay. There we go. Director Orzechowski.
So piggyback on Director West's comment, lots of variables here. Looking at method C, vegetation mapping, using the aerial imagery and satellite images. So year one was done. Because our weather here kind of fluctuates up and down. How, Mr. Barnes, how do we account for all these different variables? Is it, for example, for those images that's being presented today, will there be a field verification if it changes next year, yet conditions for the most part stay the same? How does that process look like?
The GSP has a protocol in place to consider GDEs and ensure that no undesirable results occur. So it really is those monitoring investigations are really triggered by a concern that groundwater levels could be nearing a trigger level, nearing a historic low or a trigger level. As I mentioned before, the biology part of this has been done to characterize what the vegetation signal is telling us now, what has been resilient over all these years, and particularly through the last decade of drought. What's out there now that is thriving and has access to water. So we're really focusing on those areas and then creating a data set and understanding of the dynamic to be able to use moving forward to manage the groundwater basin.
Will the enhanced vegetation index be modified by a field rep in the report? Will, for example, there be an asterisk for a particular map if a severe event is noticed for that particular section, like MLAA will turn into MLA, for example?
That's the whole point of the monitoring, isn't it? Yes, if that signal comes up, then we will present it to the board. We will present management actions immediately when that data comes out. The question of, is this an exercise that happens every year, or if it happens only in years where groundwater levels are trending down and getting close to triggers, remains to be part of the GSP to be developed.
All right, in that case, Mr. Vergoods, what's the frequency of monitoring? And let's just stick with method C.
Method C was proposed every 5 years, whether or not we're near the triggers. That's the more detailed vegetation mapping.
So a single timestamp every 5 years?
Yes, and then I just want to clarify something that Tom said with the EVI data. I think you mentioned we do management actions if the EVI data said something. We'd also have to make a determination if we recommended management actions to your board that it was due to groundwater pumping, not just dryness. So minor clarification, but an important one to make for the discussion today.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, President.
Director Natoli.
Thank you, President Bryden. I share the concern raised by the public about the number of data collection locations we have that we have access to. So, Mr. Cole, I was hoping in your explanation to Director Gutzeit earlier that you would explain how the negotiations with 5 Point are going for us to gain access to 66% of our data collection locations. So could you please comment on how those negotiations are going? We can't wait 2 or 3 years to finish negotiations to have access to those other 6 locations.
I would say they're imminent. We have been working on them for too long at this point, frankly. But I believe we're in very close to a final agreement phase. So I would suspect very shortly, hopefully by the next board meeting, I'll be able to present that agreement has been put in place.
I certainly hope that is the case. Thank you, Mr. President.
Yep.
Okay, Director Martin.
Just kind of tie this up a little bit. Is it well, we've got the experts here. Is your expectation that after several years of monitoring and reporting and measuring and correlating with rainfall and number of other factors that you'll probably get a much better understanding of how the groundwater moves in the basin, such that you'll have be in a better position, that is, to advise us on what's actually happening? Is that your expectation?
Yes, it is, Vice President Martin. We need to get more data in the tank before we can really correlate things like we'd like to.
Okay, looking forward to it.
Okay, additional comment? If not, this was a discussion item, so I think we're wrapped up. I think that takes us to item 3.2. This is consideration to adopt the Santa Clara River Valley East Groundwater Subbasin Groundwater Sustainability Plan 2022 Annual Report. And Mr. Virgutz, I believe this is you again.
Thank you, President Bryden, excuse me. So we have another presentation this time. John Porcello from GSI Water is with us to help walk us through some of the details. Uni, next slide, please. So this is the second time we've been in front of your board to present an annual report. So yay team, 2 down. We do this because partly it's required by the regulation, but also annual reports are good to prepare. And in this case, it's a good way for us to present whether or not the basin is within the metrics that were set up in the groundwater sustainability plan. It's also a good opportunity for stakeholders to become engaged. Next slide, please. So there are a number of requirements for the annual report. This report includes data about groundwater elevations, extractions, surface water, etc., change in storage. Next slide, please. So scope. This is a water year 2022 report. So it goes October 21 through September 2022. This report wouldn't have been as complete if not for us receiving data from other entities, including 5 Point, Disney, and others that help provide information for this report. So we want to give credit there. Next slide, please. From a big picture, and then I'm going to turn it over to John. We're within our metrics for the groundwater elevations, the groundwater and storage, for land subsidence. We've talked about a couple of the technical issues with the GDE triggers. So where we say depletion of interconnected surface water there's an asterisk. We do have some issues with the triggers not being right. And with degraded groundwater quality, we are meeting the objectives. There are some areas of the basin that have high salts that are well known, and those salts are because of the naturally occurring geologic material. So we are meeting our objectives for the GSP. And with that, I want to turn it over to John. Thanks, John.
Good afternoon. My name's John Porcello. I'm a hydrologist with GSI Water Solutions. It's my first chance to actually be here in person for a GSA board meeting, so I'm glad to finally be able to come. And I've been working in the basin a little over 20 years, primarily as a groundwater modeler. I've built the model and looked at a lot of the data over time, and have helped with putting together the GSP and now preparing these annual reports as well. So wanted to walk you through some of the highlights of each section of the report. So if we can go to the next slide. The report is largely organized around probably 2/3 of it is around just two of the groundwater sustainability indicators. And this is following what DWR asks these reports to report on. And those two indicators are the groundwater elevations, how those are looking, and the groundwater and storage, how those storage numbers are trending. So really sections 2 through 7 focus on those two topics. You may recall there are 6 sustainability indicators in general that basins have to look at for groundwater sustainability. This basin looks at 5 of those 6 because the 6th one is seawater intrusion, which doesn't matter out here too far from the coast. But as far as the other indicators besides groundwater elevations and groundwater storage, we do touch on our progress in section 8 with those other indicators, which are land subsidence, depletion of interconnected surface water, and water quality. So I'll touch on each of the sections. Next slide, please. Section 2, part of the function of this report is to not just report out to DWR, but it's also to provide the GSA with a way to provide information to the public as well. As we discussed a moment ago, reports like these are on the GSA website. So one of the things we've done in section 2 is always just provide a quick overview of the basin setting, describing, for example, that we have 2 primary aquifers in this basin, the alluvial aquifer and the Saugus Formation, including this graphic that's a cross-sectional view showing that we have this, surficial alluvial aquifer underlain by a very thick Saugus Formation, but kind of almost a bowl-shaped structure in terms of just the regional geologic setting. And then, of course, we have all these hydrologic processes occurring on the ground surface, as well as the pumping that goes on in the basin. So, giving people a pictorial overview. Next slide, please. Then, of course, a very important part of evaluating conditions each year is understanding what climate has done and where we are in the overall pattern of climate. So each year we go and look at the historical record. This is from the Newhall Fire Station rain gauge that's got records going all the way back into the early 1900s, or even some records in the 1890s, kind of sporadic, but they're there. And this plot shows you from 1930 through the most recent water year, 2022, so 93 years of annual precipitation on the upper graph, with an average rainfall a little over 17 inches. And then the lower graph is plotting up a couple of things. It's showing generally with the black line, whether the trends are generally up or generally down or kind of hovering around a certain level. And then the colors are a way that my team's been thinking for a long time about just, where are we in the cycle of things? The blue bars being generally wet periods, the tan color being a generally dry period. You can see one in particular from the mid-40s to the mid-60s, lasted 20 years, was prevailing dry conditions. And the gray bars being periods where it was kind of right around normal. Obviously, the last year or two have been prevailing dry conditions. So that curve's been going down, and certainly was the case back from about, I'd say 2012 through about 2017 or so. Next slide, please. We also present in the report a second way of thinking about those climate cycles. This is actually a method DWR asks us to use, so we put this plot together as well. They use 5 different categories of climate conditions, ranging from wet to above normal to below normal to dry to critical. As you can see from the color schemes, it's sometimes a little hard to tease out, you know, kind of the overall prevailing trends, which is another reason we like the prior graph, but we put both of those in here because they're both very useful. Next slide. Section 2 also presents the groundwater monitoring network, and we've updated the map this year to reflect the new well installations that have occurred. Now, this map is showing several things. It's showing the wells that are the ones dedicated to monitoring groundwater levels under the sustainability plan. That's, I don't remember the exact number, but it's somewhere in the mid-20s, I think, is the total number of wells. Now, this map actually shows many other wells as well, because a lot of data is collected across the basin, and we do work with data at other wells as well. For example, I think it was Tom or Rick mentioned we're refining the groundwater flow model right now. And one of the things we're doing is we're looking at all the water level data that's been collected the last couple of years since we completed the GSP, and just accounting for those data, not only at the wells that are part of the GSP monitoring program, but elsewhere. Next slide. And then this is a map, just a little simpler view of the monitoring network for the GDEs. And again, this pertains to the sustainability indicator that's called depletion of interconnected surface water. So, you know, on this map, the orangish color, that's where the alluvial aquifer is present. The green is the area that, as was shown in the GSP, is areas where the groundwater levels are generally within 30 feet of ground surface. So where GDEs are or potentially are present. And then the purple dots or whatever they are the places where we're doing the GDE monitoring specifically right now. So there's 8 of those sites. I should clarify that. There were 3 wells that were already in the ground before last year. So they are NLF G3, which is between I-5 and the mouth of Castaic Creek along the Santa Clara River. There's NLF E, which is up in Castaic Valley, just north of Castaic Junction. And then NLF W5 up in San Francisco Canyon. And if I got any of that wrong, it's my memory, because I can't see that far away from the screen. And then we have the other 5 piezometers that were installed along the river back in, I think it was in March. And the monitoring began in March. So GDE A, B, and then west of I-5, we have C, D, and then E, which is down at the west end. Next slide, please. In addition to that, we had some temperature probes in the ground for much of 2022. These were very shallow probes that were literally just pushed into the ground, with a lightweight drill rig. And they were there to monitor temperatures of shallow pore water and to see what those temperatures might look like over time. With all the recent rains, well, before I get into that, so we had 2 that were near the GDEA piezometer, which is in that MLA area that Tom described earlier. And then we had 2 down by the I-5 bridge in the MLB area. And then we had one near the McBean Bridge as well. They're all gone. The river's taken them all out. we found a data logger hanging in some vegetation somewhere, and we're trying to dry that out now and see if we can get the latest data from when the flow event happened. But the river disturbed all of those, and folks at 5 Point have told us that they've had damage to some that they installed as well. Next slide, please. The other thing about the monitoring network is that there's monitoring for other sustainability indicators besides groundwater elevations and besides GDE. So I'm going to touch on those quickly. One of the other sustainability indicators is land subsidence. And at this time, discussions are ongoing with the County Department of Public Works about accessing and surveying certain benchmarks that we identified in the GSP as some locations that we think would be best to do that monitoring. But in the meantime, while that's all going on, we've gone and looked at the most recent satellite data that DWR makes available to basins to understand what's happening with subsidence. And you know, those data for this past water year show very little in the way of any ground elevation changes, and certainly well below any thresholds related to that would be of a concern for subsidence. And that's what this map is showing. Next slide, please. Okay, so that was section 2 alone. I was just talking about the basin, how it works in our monitoring network. So now I'm going to start ticking through some of the specifics of the evaluations of conditions in the past year, starting with groundwater elevations. What we do in this section is a few different things. First, some maps that show contours of groundwater elevations. We do them for the wet season. We do them for seasonal low conditions in the dry season. This is the seasonal low conditions map, and this one's for the alluvial aquifer, showing groundwater flow patterns in the wells where we have data. Contours largely look very similar to what they looked like last year, and you know what they've often looked like in terms of what they infer about flow directions in the alluvium, which is that groundwater flows generally from east to west along the Santa Clara River Valley corridor, and we have groundwater flow in these alluvial canyons that are tributaries to the river. The new things this year about this particular map were that we had water level data that we received from 5 Point that allowed us to expand the contours further west than we were able to do last year. And of course, we had the GDE piezometers to also give us some additional water level control as we drew these maps. Next slide. That map is for the alluvium. This one's for the Saugus. This one, there's no changes to the well network. We have data in the same places that we've had it in the past, and we see something very similar to what we've seen for a long time, which is that there are very flat gradients in that unit, except down in kind of the southern area. We see some big differences between a few of between the water levels in a few of the wells that were the former Newhall County Water District well field. It's been very interesting to look at that and think about how that works as I calibrate a flow model, for example. Next slide. So in addition to the contour maps, we also, and these are in an appendix that we refer to in section 3, we have time series plots, and these go back in general where we can plot them quite a long time. We try to go back as far as 1980 because we do have wells in the basin with great water level records going back to the 1980s, in some cases even the 1950s for wells further west. I'll just show a couple examples here. This is in the alluvial aquifer. This is a well E17 that is located along Castaic Creek near Highway 126. And this is kind of typical of wells in the western portion of the basin. I'm sorry, let me step back for a minute. The colors schemes that you see here, the vertical bars are again those water year types that DWR is interested in. So we plot those in the background. The blue dots and lines, that's the actual water level data. The green and orange lines, those are sustainability criteria for groundwater elevations as a sustainability indicator. So the green line, that's what's called the measurable objective. That's the water level where you're saying over a long period of time, you want the water levels to be somewhere around that line. They may oscillate above and below, but on average, they're going to be somewhere right at about that level. The orange line is the minimum threshold. And again, in the way that sigma is defined, a minimum threshold is where if you reach that threshold, you may have an undesirable result, and that is something to be looked at. So at this particular well, this is in the western portion of the basin. The data go back to, and I can't read it, but I think it's 2008 or so. And you can see that groundwater levels generally fluctuate right around that green line right now and are kind of stable from year to year. Next slide. This is a well much farther east in the basin. This is the North Oaks Central well. So actually just kind of over that way. And the vertical scale is the same as the last slide we were looking at, but you can see there's this great oscillation over multiple decades. And what that is all about is it's showing the responses of that aquifer system here in the eastern part of the basin to variations in climate and rainfall recharge and stream flow recharge. So for example, you see some time periods when the water levels decline notably and then take a very sudden rise. And that sudden rise occurs when these episodic recharge events come along, as has happened a few times in the past and probably is happening right now. Next slide, please. And then just the last example, this is from the Saugus Formation. This is well 206, so one of the new wells near Magic Mountain, drilled back in, I think it was 2004, came online in 2005, if I remember correctly. And those are the water levels in that well. Again, you know, showing not a lot of variation from year to year. Next slide. Section 4 now starts to talk about groundwater uses, and the next few sections talk about groundwater and total water use. So for groundwater extractions, what I'm showing here in this table, we are showing the past 3 years of groundwater usage. We show it for each type of water use: municipal, rural, domestic, small public water systems, golf courses, the agricultural water use. We also show the pumping that's occurring over at Whitaker Burmite for the groundwater containment and treatment system that's on that property. So there have been a few small refinements to the numbers that the agency has received over time from some of the other water users, which I think are primarily the golf courses and the agricultural use. And so we decided in this year's report, we were going to make sure to present the final numbers for 2020, water years 2020 and 2021, and not just this year's numbers. Looking at this, you can see that the total water use was slightly less in 2022 than it was in the prior water year, and the past 2 water years for groundwater have been a little bit higher than, well, yeah, a little higher than in 2020. So that's groundwater extractions. Next slide, please. Section 5 then reports on other water uses in the basin. And what DWR is interested in here is imported water supplies. They're also interested in recycled water, which is in that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th column. They also ask basins to report on any other uses of surface water, any other surface water sources in a basin. And of course, there aren't any here in this one. There's not groundwater being pulled out of the Santa Clara River for use. So those are all presented here. For the imported water supplies, DWR asks that the state water project supplies be identified separately from what's called local imported water. So of course, the local imported water, those are the water banks and other exchanges and agreements that agencies have. Looking at total water use, you can see that interestingly in water year 2022, there was a notable decrease in the amount of imported water supplies, a slight reduction in recycled water as well. But predominantly the change was state water project imports were down compared to the last 2 years. Next slide. So putting that all together into total water use in section 6, the groundwater, the imported supplies, and the recycled water. And you can see that in water year 2022, the total water use was about 63,100 acre feet roughly, which is lower than the past 2 water years. Next slide. So so we've covered groundwater levels and what they're doing. We've covered what's happened with water use. Now we get to the last big topic they really want to know about, which is what's happening with the amount of groundwater and storage in the basin. And this is all about really thinking about how does that storage change from year to year, because that's the thing you can measure the most readily. And so what DWR asks for is a fair amount of detail in that they ask us to evaluate changes both annually, you know, how much did it change this year? How much did it change the next year? How much did it change the year before? Then they also ask us to evaluate what has that accumulated change been since January 1st of 2015. And you may recognize that date as being the date that's essentially the effective start date for Sigma for evaluating conditions in the basin going forward against what they were at that time. So that's the reason they have us do that cumulative change calculation. So that's a time element. We look at time in 2 different ways, but then we have spatial elements to consider. They ask us to look at 3 different geographic scales when it comes to this storage topic. What's the change in storage for the basin as a whole? What is the change in storage in each of the 2 principal aquifers? And what does that look like spatially, you know, for sub areas within each aquifer? So I'm going to march you through that here. Next slide. So on a basin-wide basis, we've tabulated here the 2 columns on the right show the annual change and the cumulative change in storage. And the columns to their left provide as kind of a reference information what rainfall was doing and what the cumulative departure in rainfall has been during that same period of time. And so, you know, you can see, for example, that there's generally been a net cumulative negative cumulative departure of rainfall since January of 2015. The basin as a whole, though, that cumulative change has fluctuated some. It's been negative at times, then it became positive for a while, and it's, you know, turning negative again. That's very normal. That just reflects the fact that the basin cycles through periods of wet versus dry conditions. So this is basin as a whole. Next slide, please. This is another graphic just showing the same thing. And I'm not going to explain all the lines on here because it's a little tricky. DWR really likes this graphic, so that's why we give it to them. But the thing to take away from this are those colored bars in the background. The sandstone color, those are the critical rainfall years, and the more tan color is the dry years and the below normal years. So you can see that those have made up 5 of the past 8 years. And when we were not dry, critical, or below normal, we didn't have a very wet year. We only had those green bars, which were above normal, and the rainfall wasn't that much above normal. And you know, it'll be interesting. Let's look at next year's plot, right? Because we're probably going to get one of those wet bars. Let's hope we do. So next slide, please. So those were the basin as a whole. This table shows the changes for each principal aquifer. So the first four columns again are just the water year and rainfall information. Then there are two columns there for the Saugus Formation and the last two columns for the alluvial aquifer. Again, you can see that the cumulative change in the Saugus Formation, that unit is slower to respond to rainfall. It does receive rainfall, of course, recharge and as well from the alluvium. But it takes a while for that to get there. And so, the drought has created somewhat of a downward trend in that Saugus Formation storage. But having said that, we see real positive signs shallow up in the system. We see what's generally a positive increase for the alluvial aquifer. So this is all kind of classic hydrogeology for people who work in basins like these, as deeper aquifer systems do take somewhat longer to respond to what's happening at the surface than the superficial aquifers do. Next slide. And then we just give them also spatially some views of what these numbers look like. What we've done is we've carved up, in this case, the alluvium, we've carved up into 9 different areas. Some of this is based on how annual reports for the past maybe 20 years, SCV Water and its predecessor have produced annual reports about the basin and thought about the hydrology in different sub areas. So we worked with some of those sub areas and tweaked them a little bit as, we've continued to, think about this basin some more and having worked on the GSP. But in this map, you can see in each of those sub areas, there's generally an increase in water levels. And next slide, the map in the Saugus Formation, we carved this up into 3 sub areas. These were all the same as last year, by the way, for those of you who might recall those maps. And probably the interesting thing to point out here is the sub area on the northeast, on the east side of the San Gabriel Fault. There's no groundwater pumping going on up there. Yet it's got a fairly negative change in storage. That's just simply reflecting the fact that there's been a drought in this area. That's really what drives it. Then the other 2 areas, of course, the darker blue is up where the LA County has its well, and there's very much higher groundwater elevations up there because of some subsurface structural features compared to the more purple area further to the south. There's about a 300 to 400 foot difference in water levels between those 2 areas. It's quite remarkable. Next slide. So again, you've seen this slide before, and I think I'll let Rick wrap up the presentation.
Oh, thanks, John. Yeah, we've seen this before, and I think we were going to run into a couple other components here. Next slide, please, Uni. We'd mentioned the salt and nutrient management plan earlier with the water quality objectives. We still have that area, John, is it MB1Z or something? The crosshatched area in the middle of the map there that has some elevated salts. The earlier studies for the salt and nutrient management plan identify that because of some geologic issues there. And we've looked at the data since the salt and nutrient management plan was updated last year. The trends are similar. And so that's good. Next slide, please. And these are just a couple wrap-up slides. So first one here, progress implementing. So piezometers are in. We've talked a lot about piezometers today in the monitoring, the GDE studies, the LIDAR survey, these transect surveys. These are all really important because they provide data that helps the model have better, more correct information. So this is good stuff to get done. And it's critical that we do it. Planning continues for these other programs, land subsidence. As John mentioned, we're coordinating with LA County. SCV Water is also going to be going on a field trip here, and I use that in air quotes. It's not a big bus full of people. It's probably Rick Vasilopoulos and another staff member, maybe me, going out in the field and scoping out areas for installation of benchmarks. We'll do that in coordination with LA County's benchmark program. After that, we'll be talking with the city and county again about the proposed subsidence monitoring network and whether or not the county or the city has anything in particular that they think we should include in that. Water quality monitoring program for domestic wells. We'll hit that this year. And similar with the non-de minimis wells identification and reporting. We'll hit this in 2023 as well. Next slide, please, Uni. Can you back up one, Uni? Director Gutzeit, we talked a little bit about the data management system. So that's going to support what we're doing here. We're working on refining the flow model. We will be back to your board this year with another discussion about where we think the refined GDE triggers and minimum thresholds should be. Don't know if it'll be June or September, but it's coming. The work on the flow model is wrapping up. We'll continue with the monitoring and the outreach. We did submit that grant application for the deep Saugus Formation wells. It may be months until we hear back, so we'll just keep you posted. If we come back 3 months from now and we don't have an answer, just understand that DWR has told us it may take a very long time. Stay tuned on that. Next slide, Uni. Well, while that's waiting to come up, I'll give you a peek under the tent. The next slide is the final slide. It's the recommendation to your board that you consider this annual report and adopt it. And that concludes our presentation, and thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. Okay, so let's open it up for public comment, in person or virtual public comment. Wait for a sec.
There's none.
Okay. Close the public comment then. We'll move on to director discussion. Who'd like to start us off? Director Gutzeit.
Few questions, and I really like this presentation. This is our second annual report. Was the first one accepted with flying colors? Did they give us any feedback? And I'm guessing we're sticking with the same approach as last year.
We have not heard any feedback on it.
But they didn't. Okay, good or bad? Okay, but we're basically sticking with the same approach, I assume.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
I love the colors that indicate cumulative departure from rainfall and, you know, your simplified version and the more complex version. I think that's really helpful because you can easily see it. It is clear from slide 24 that our total groundwater in storage, those lines look like the cumulative departure from normal on storage almost exactly tracks the rainfall, right? You can see the two lines doing this, so that's good. Will the salt nutrient management plan rewrite resolve that weird crosshatched water quality issue where we think it's minerals? Are we going to be able to change the objective because we think that's it, or what's going to happen with the rewrite?
We're looking at that. Ernesto and I have been talking about that component and also rerunning this. I want to call it a mixing model or a the salt nutrient management plan model traditionally has only been run every 3, 4, 5 years when we've had to do these updates. But we're looking to run that annually now because it's helpful for what we're doing with the GSA. So we'll continue to engage with Ernesto, and it'd be nice if we could get that area with the high salts reclassified.
Okay. So we'll see. Okay, and last one, you mentioned, and I know this is going to take outreach, but getting water quality information from domestic wells. And I believe we are selecting those wells hopefully with good construction logs and it, so that we're not getting bad data if there's a marginal construction issue. Is that correct?
That's exactly correct.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Director West.
I had a couple of thoughts. As you mentioned that east of North Oaks, the groundwater oscillates greatly up and down. And I know it does. So I'm hoping you're going to be studying that upper East End basin thoroughly in the future because the headwaters come down the Santa Clara River. While they don't have the storage capacity like the Saugus Formation and a deep alluvial, you certainly have impacts from upper Santa Clara River and how the water drawdown up there happens and what people are doing up there. I just want to bring up to the board the issue, it hasn't been talked about much in a long time. This is CMEX mine. And they would be totally reliant on pumping wells up right there above Solid Lake Canyon Road on that side. And that could be very detrimental to everything that you're working on and planning. And they cannot use salts to control dust because it violates everything regional water wants. They don't want salt in the river. You don't want salt in the river. None of us do. So they would be having to monitor all their dust, which when you're blasting 2-3 times a week, you certainly gonna have a lot of dust, and it's PM10s and finer. So you'd be using a lot of water. So I'd just like the board to be looking at the issue of water up there and what we need to do to monitor and make impacts on that. It's really critical to everybody in this valley, as I know you all know. So I was glad that you're looking at subsidence through the satellite network there, and appreciate all you're doing. But I just wanted to bring up the fact that I've seen drought, and then I've seen 49.5 inches of rain in the same time period. We've just had 29, and I've seen the valley underwater. So it's nice when we have the water, and it's nice you're monitoring it, but we also have to preserve it. So I would just say one more time, we need to find more storage. We have a lot of open space around us. We should be working together to do a good job of holding on to the water we have and not allowing people that would do serious detrimental actions on the Santa Clara River to do them.
Additional thoughts? Okay, I think it's time to call for a motion. Or comments?
No, I'm just going to say excellent report. I really appreciate it. I liked the charts this year. I thought they were very good.
Hmm.
And with that, I would move to approve the report.
Thank you, Director Cooper. Second?
I'll second Director Gutzeit.
Thank you. Okay, roll call vote, or second time I did this. Is there discussion? Let's move on to a roll call vote.
When I call your name, please state your vote. Director Cooper,
Yes.
Director Gutzeit,
Yes.
Director Natoli,
Aye.
Director Olzahowski,
Yes.
Director West,
Aye.
Vice President Martin,
Yes.
President Biden.
Yes,
Thank you. Item 3.2 has passed.
very good. That takes us on to item 3.3. This is our Bouquet or Bouquet Canyon Creek update. Mr. Cole, I think you'll be.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Chair Bryden. Just real briefly, wanted to update the board on current activities for Bouquet Creek restoration. The stakeholders continue to meet. We're meeting monthly. There's a core group of stakeholders that include us as a member of the Groundwater Sustainability Agency, the Water Agency, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, County of Los Angeles, Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. So it is a pretty broad group. Still some good momentum going there. I think I reported last time, the focus has been on applying for a Wildlife Conservation Board grant fund to help with the restoration efforts. And that application was due on the 1st of March, and I believe that has been submitted. So that'll be kind of a, similar process. It goes through a grant funding scoring process, and hopefully we'll hear not too far out in the distant future. Just a couple other things on Bouquet Creek. SCV Water was able to work with our local Congressman Garcia, and we did secure a community funding request of $300,000 for Bouquet Creek. So right now I've basically offered that in the group as we need to figure out how to spend those dollars. I think what it's going to go towards is, trying to continue to move the project to shovel ready. So excited about that. I was happy to have the congressman participate in that. And so that was a good outcome. The final item I'll just talk about in that general area of Bouquet Creek. The water agency is moving forward with the pipeline to Lark Ranch. It has been a very long process, but it is coming to fruition. So we'll hopefully be out there constructing in not the too distant future. So I'm just excited those of you that have been involved with that, it has taken a very long time. The process has been challenging, but hopefully we'll get to the rewarding part here. Looking to have that pipeline bring relief not only to Lark Ranch, but others that choose to connect to it along the way of existing property owners in the area. So that's what I have, and happy to answer any questions.
Very cool. Any public comment?
There is none.
Okay, director's comments? Okay, start with Director Martin. Oh, actually, you're the vice president. You know what? Go ahead.
Thank you, Steve, for the report. Yeah, we're very anxious to see this project move forward, but in relation to Bouquet Creek, I know it's not on the agenda, but it's related to Bouquet Creek. What has been the effect of all these heavy rains that we've gotten up there? Has we know anything about what's going on in Bouquet Creek during that time?
I actually haven't been able to make it out there. I would suspect it's like what it usually does in Bouquet Creek when the big rains happen and the road generally is closed now during those big events because of safety issues. But I have not been able to see it myself, and I haven't heard anything specific about it. Director Martin.
Thought I'd ask.
Director Goodside?
Yeah, a specific question. I got very excited at the Urban Water Institute the other week when Ray Tremblay gave a presentation on the county's new approach to integrated infrastructure projects. And he said he was going to email you, or he said he did pretty much like right then. Is there any further discussion on looking at more integrated projects and project funding besides the fish issues on that creek? I heard, I've said before, I heard from the residents, they were looking at road safety issues and recreation issues. And Ray seemed to think, that's what that integrated approach was supposed to catch. How is that going? And is that going to be looked into?
It definitely has been talked about quite a bit in the group. So I'll just let you know that, that is definitely on everybody's radar. I'll follow up with a little bit more on that to see more on the how part of it, of what's been submitted versus, kind of a more fully integrated project that could have, public access and those types of things, enhancements to that portion of the project.
Yeah, and I'll get you my notes. I'm just behind, but he said they have that basically these integrated projects have much more chance of funding, and they go for like big deal, and then they promote it in DC. And he said the first batch they're doing right now, but it's going to be an ongoing process. So if stuff like this could be a future project, which would be cool if we could do that.
Other comments? Yeah, the infrastructure LA stuff is pretty cool. And I saw you there, but didn't get a chance to say hi. I'm like 7 feet tall. Hiding in the corner. I'm mostly talking, not presentations for me. Okay, I think that takes us to item 4. That's future agenda items. So I think, Uni, we start with public comment for this. Any thoughts from the public?
There is none.
Okey dokes, directors.
I just have to add one more request that we all look at recycled water together. However, that means all agencies. It's certainly going to be really important in the future, especially since outdoor water use can use recycled water without the kind of restrictions, and none of us want to drink it. So let's figure out how we can use it in a good way.
Very good. Other comments? I have one very briefly. SCV, oh, my boss. SCV Water approached me as president of our GSA to sign some earmark letters, support for earmarks. So I'd like to report that, and Steve, I don't know if you want to take a quick second and talk about the project. This is, I believe you called it your PFAS treatment and disinfection facility.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up, Chair Bryden. So time to time, various grant opportunities come up and the Groundwater Sustainability Agency board is asked to weigh in on some of those examples. Past examples have been like the city's Via Princessa Park. It's been a good example of that, where there was a request made to the Groundwater Sustainability Agency to write a letter of indicating support of that. And so we've done that periodically for various projects over time. The most recent one that Chair Bryden is bringing up is for SCV Water's PFAS treatment facility. This is for a project called the S Wells, and that project would essentially restore 3 wells that have been lost to PFAS contamination currently. So that was the request that was made, and that will be part of a submittal that the water agency is seeking community directed spending on.
Yeah, very cool. $16 million, 6,000 GPM, 9,600 acre feet a year, serving 10,000 households. Really cool project. So letters were sent to Senators Feinstein and Padilla, as well as Representative Garcia. So I took that action on our behalf. Thank you. Okay, nothing else for me. Word good. Okay, I think that.
Mr. President, then I would like to take this opportunity to ask for an addition to future agendas anytime. The president of the board is asked to endorse a request from a local agency or water agency. If it's not something that was presented to the board for our review and approval, it should be agendized and at least reported to us. If possible, before the letter is sent out, it would be nice to have prior notification of those requests. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we should try to do that. So we did check, board president does have authority to do this, but I think that sharing of information is a good idea. Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, other thoughts before we adjourn? I'm going to put Uni on the spot. Can you tell us when our next meeting is?
I don't have the exact date, but it will be the month of June.
Okay, the month of June. All right, this meeting stands adjourned. We'll see you in June. Thank you.